There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Women like Dorothy Davis, a 74-year-old widow, rarely go missing. She lived in the seaside suburb of Lurline Bay in southeast Sydney. She had friends, children and grandchildren. Her life was peaceful. She was financially comfortable. And the people who loved her knew where she would be on any given day. She had a lot to live for. But in May 1995, Dorothy went to visit a friend and she never came home. Kerry, a healthy and well-liked 39-year-old, was also not the kind of woman who goes missing. She was married to Bernie Whelan, the CEO of a large multinational company that made forklifts called Crown Equipment. With their 3 children, the family lived on their sizable property at Kurrajong in northwestern Sydney. But in May 1997, Kerry made a trip to Parramatta and never came home.
Kerry, if you can hear what I'm saying, I want you to know that we all love you. We will do anything to get you back, but most of all, don't give up.
These 2 women didn't know each other, but they did have one thing in common. They both happened to know a man named Bruce Burrell.
But how did you feel? I mean, the place is swarming with coppers and they think that you've buried a body around here.
Pretty low, because whilst all the effort is being concentrated upon me, whoever has been responsible for this crime is out there laughing. I can assure you I'm not laughing.
I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with former Senior Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi. His new book, Missing, Presumed Dead, tells the story of Bruce Burrell and the double murder case that shocked Australia. All proceeds from this book will be donated to Australian charities that assist and support victims of crime, the families of deceased victims, and the relatives of those who have gone missing. You'll find a link to purchase in our show notes. Can you tell us a little bit about the childhood and upbringing of Bruce Burrell?
Bruce Burrell was born in the Goulburn district of New South Wales to a rural family. His father was a wool classer. It was a very normal, conservative, average Australian rural family. So far as I'm aware, he had a normal upbringing, but he showed early signs in his late teens of being prepared to break the law. He was caught stealing cheques from a bank, and his father managed to reach an arrangement with the bank that the father would repay the money that had been stolen and the bank wouldn't notify the police. So that was all kind of swept under the carpet at the time.
And in those early instances, what do you think he was motivated by? Was it greed? Did he have a sort of fixation on money?
Look, I don't think it's nearly that simple. I mean, I'm more aware of what happened later on. And I think that what happened later on shows characteristics that are very clearly narcissistic. It shows a complete lack of empathy with his victims and the victims' families and their suffering, and an overestimation of his own capacity to plan for every eventuality. And in reality, what happened was that when he committed the crimes for which he was convicted, he was actually leaving the most serious evidence of his crimes along the way for the police to later find. And it was as though he was oblivious of that. It was as though he was so confident of his own superior abilities that he didn't realise what he was doing.
Yeah, as though that narcissism made him believe he was a lot cleverer than he was. I think that's what comes through.
That's correct, yes.
In 1985, he married Dallas Bromley. What was Bruce like as a partner or a husband? What was their relationship like?
Look, I think their relationship reflected his personality. He was initially very charming. He was able to pretend as though he empathised with people. And I think that with Dallas, he very quickly charmed her. And what she saw initially was a man who showed every promise of being a fun partner. But within a short time, he started to become morose and self-obsessed and lazy and not a good communicator at all, and constantly seeking money from other people, including his wife.
On that subject of laziness, he was a man who struggled to hold down any sort of full-time employment. How did he come to know a man named Bernie Whelan and then work for him?
Bernie Whelan was the CEO of the Australian branch of a large multinational company that made forklifts. And he came to know Bruce Burrell when Bruce was working with an ad agency that this company used to publicise their products. And the name of Bernie Whelan's company was Crown Equipment. So they came to know each other in that context, and then at a certain stage, Crown Equipment was looking around to employ some internal staff to do their advertising work, and Bruce Burrell applied and got the job. And Bruce Burrell and Bernie Whelan actually became quite friendly, the reason being they had a lot of interests in common, in particular rural interests. They were both interested in guns and shooting. They were both interested in cattle. They were both interested in rural properties. So they had quite a bit in common. So initially they became friends, but within a certain period, Bernie Whelan came to realise that Bruce Burrell was a rather inadequate employee, and when a recession hit, he had to let some of his staff go, and Bruce Burrell was one of the first to go, and Bernie Whelan had to tell his friend that he had to let him go. And at the time, it appeared that Bruce Burrell took it quite well, but in reality, he was deeply, deeply resentful of his boss having sacked him. And within a short time after that, their friendship just disappeared.
One of the catalysts for that friendship really deteriorating was to do with a gun, wasn't it? And Bruce being dishonest?
Yes. There were actually two incidents. One of the incidents involved a gun. Bruce Burrell had this tendency that if he liked something that belonged to someone else, he would somehow get hold of it and steal it from them. And he convinced Bernie Whelan to sell his gun and to sell it through Bruce Burrell. So Bruce took the gun, and then a few days later he rang Bernie and said that the gun had been stolen from the back of his car, whereas it hadn't really, because some years later, when the police were searching Bruce Burrell's homestead at Bungonia, they actually found the gun. So he'd just stolen it from him.
And so that obviously made Bernie Whelan suspect of this guy and their friendship. Was that when their relationship started to fall apart?
Their friendship disappeared after the second incident when Bernie Whelan his property was in drought. He had some cattle. Bruce Burrell offered to adjust the cattle at his place at Bungonia, so the cattle were moved, and then a few weeks later, Bruce Burrell informs Bernie, oh, look, there was a hole in the fence and the cattle have all escaped into the nearby national park, and I've looked for them and haven't been able to find them. And it was at that stage that Bernie Whelan thought, I don't trust this bloke. I don't know whether he's stolen my gun. I don't know whether he's stolen my cattle, but I'm not going to have anything more to do with him. And that was the end of their relationship.
It was, I think, a few years later in 1994 that Burrell was looking at finding a new home in his area. He became quite obsessed with that. And he approached a man named Charlie Spears. What happened there?
Charlie Spears owned a property not far from where Bruce Burrell was living with his wife in a townhouse. And Bruce Burrell desperately wanted to buy Charlie Spears' house. Charlie Spears was quite elderly. He was very infirm. He could barely walk out of his house. He was really housebound. And Charlie Spears and his wife were approached by Bruce Burrell about selling their house, and the wife was prepared to sell his house, but Charlie didn't want to. He only thought he had a few years to go and he wanted to live out the rest of his life in his home, which had a nice view of the ocean, which Bruce Burrell's place didn't have. So whilst Charlie's wife was willing to sell, Charlie wasn't ready to sell. A few weeks later, Charlie's wife went to play bingo at the local club. She came home after a few hours and Charlie was nowhere to be seen. One of the items of furniture in his lounge room had been overturned. His slippers were just all over the room and Charlie was never seen again.
Was that investigated as suspicious? What did police put that down to?
Look, the police did investigate it, but they had absolutely no evidence to go on. And they eventually came to the conclusion that they thought that Charlie must have somehow, unexpectedly, managed to get out of his house to some nearby rocks overlooking the ocean and that he'd somehow, miraculously, thrown himself into the sea off these rocks. But his wife never believed that. She didn't think that Charlie was capable of it. And if you look at the rocks near their place, there was no way that a man in his condition could have done that. So his disappearance was completely and utterly unexplained.
How did Bruce then meet a woman named Dorothy Davis?
Dorothy Davis was a woman in her mid-70s who had known Bruce's wife for virtually all her life. In fact, the two families were very close. And Bruce's wife, Dallas, was very much loved by Dorothy Davis. So when Dallas, in later life, married Bruce, of course, Dorothy Davis came to know Bruce.
And she was smart, she was independent, she was savvy, she was relatively wealthy because she was a widow and, had control of her finances. How did Bruce broach the subject of borrowing money from her without his wife's knowledge?
Dallas had a very serious form of cancer. She'd been very ill. She'd had chemotherapy. She'd lost all her hair. But the chemotherapy worked and she'd recovered from cancer and was back at work and everything was okay. And Bruce approached Dorothy Davis and convinced her that he wanted to buy another better house for Dallas and that it would assist in Dallas's recovery. And he used a bit of blackmail. He more or less said that, if she didn't help him buy this house, that Dallas's health might suffer. And so he convinced her to lend him $100,000, which back then in 1993, I think it might have been, was a lot of money. She lent it on the basis that he would pay it back to her within a fairly short time with interest. And of course, little did she know that Bruce had a history of borrowing money and taking things that he wanted and never paying the money back.
10 months passed and she hadn't seen a sign of that money. How did she go about trying to retrieve these funds that she'd lost? Did she speak to Dallas? Did she get police involved? What did she do?
She never spoke to Dallas because Bruce had made a promise that she would tell. And after about 10 months, she started asking Bruce for the money back and he was vacillating. So eventually she actually issued him with a threat that unless he paid the money back, she'd get her solicitor to take legal action and, of course, that she'd have to tell Dallas what had happened. So this, of course, seriously threatened Bruce's reputation and his standing in his family and with his wife particularly. And what Dorothy Davis didn't know is that Bruce had absolutely no capacity to pay back the money because he'd already spent it.
In 1995, Dorothy was at home and then she told someone who was working at her house that she was off to go and visit a friend down the road. What do we know for sure about what happened the day that Dorothy never came home?
That was a week or two after she'd made the threat to Bruce of suing him and telling Dallas about the loan. One day she was at her home and she lived just around the block from where Bruce and Dallas lived. It wasn't far away at all. At the time, Dorothy Davis had a carpenter, Ken Hulse, who was working on her property for her, doing some work on her veranda. And as she left her house, she came upon Ken Hulse and she said to him, that she was just going to visit a friend, and she pointed in the direction of where Bruce and Dallas's house was, towards the ocean, and said she was just going to go there to visit a friend who'd had cancer, had chemotherapy, had lost all her hair, but had since recovered. And we could prove that the only person that she knew in that area, in that direction, fitting that description, was Dallas Burrell. So, thankfully, Dorothy said that to Ken Hulse, because otherwise there would have been no evidence of where she was going. And Ken Hulse was able to give an account within a few days of what he'd been told by Dorothy, because she was never ever seen again. It was within her capacity to walk around the block to Bruce and Dallas's house. We know that Dallas was at work that day. We know that Bruce was not at work that day. So that was very strong evidence that Dorothy Davis disappeared when she was on her way to visit the Burrell household.
What happened in the wake of her disappearance? Because what Bruce had very carefully organised was that Dorothy hadn't told really anyone about that loan. Dallas didn't know. She had been private. How were police able to make this connection?
Look, Dorothy had actually mentioned to her daughter that she'd made this loan. So after Dorothy's disappearance, Dorothy's family actually told the police about this loan to Bruce Burrell, and Bruce Burrell became a suspect. And the police went and interviewed Bruce Burrell, and he gave an account that this was not a loan, that in fact he'd helped Dallas cash a cheque of her own, and that it had gone through his account, and then he'd repaid it to her, or most of it to her, and she'd let him keep some of it as a gift. But Bruce also claimed that he'd been at work that day, so the police went to his workplace to see whether they could verify that, and in fact his workmates did clarify that not only was he at work that day, but that they'd had a luncheon for one of Bruce's workmates that day to celebrate his workmate's birthday, and the police therefore discounted Bruce Burrell as being a suspect in the disappearance of Dorothy Davis. So that was the end of any investigation of Bruce Burrell for the disappearance of Dorothy Davis until after the disappearance of Kerry Whelan.
And Kerry Whelan, what was his connection to her?
Well, there was actually no connection to speak of at all between Kerry Whelan, who was the wife of Bernie Whelan, Bruce Burrell's former employer, and Bruce. Kerry had never liked Bruce, but what happened is that in 1997, out of the blue, after years of no contact, Bruce rang up Bernie, and Bernie couldn't see the point of the conversation, but in the course of that phone conversation, Bernie happened to mention it the following Wednesday he was going to be in Adelaide for work. That very day, Bruce unexpectedly, without warning, turned up at the home of the Whelans in Kurrajong, where they lived on a large rural property. And he rang from the gate of their property, which led down a very long driveway to their home. He rang the bell and found out that, in fact, Kerry was not at home alone that day, but there were two people there. One was her son, who was home from school sick, and another one was a nanny and horse trainer, Amanda, who was at the property that day helping Kerry, doing some work around the horses. And Bruce Burrell came and visited it that day, and we don't know what was said between them, but we know that about 3 or 4 weeks later, Kerry Whelan went to Parramatta, parked her car in the underground car park of the Park Royal Hotel, walked out of the underground car park and was never seen again.
There was a ransom note that accompanied Kerry's disappearance. What did it say? What did this person want from her husband?
Look, it was a very strange ransom note. For a start, it was posted after Kerry's disappearance in southwestern Sydney, and it demanded $1.2 million ransom for the safe return of Kerry. It threatened dire consequences if the police were involved. Now, that's very strange because, of course, when it was received more than 24 hours after Kerry's disappearance, police had already been involved because nobody knew what had happened to Kerry. So that ransom note became important because we were able to show that it was actually designed for a different scenario to the one in which it was used. It was designed for a scenario where Kerry was abducted from her home and the kidnapper could leave the note at her home. So it meant that we could limit the potential number of people who were potential kidnappers to those people who had access to Kerry's home.
And what was the motive of the kidnapping? What did Bruce actually want?
By the time that the kidnapping took place in 1997, Bruce Burrell's situation had become even more desperate financially. He was absolutely broke. He owed money on his rural property at Bungonia that he loved dearly, a place called Hillydale. He had no way of paying the next month's mortgage. He was living off charity from his father and selling the odd cow here and there. He was facing financial ruin and the loss of his beloved Hillydale. So we allege that his kidnapping was carried out because he was desperate in his financial situation.
What were the first steps of police? They've got this woman who has gone missing. At first, they're thinking, well, you know, maybe she was shopping. She was in Parramatta, only a few hours have elapsed. And then, of course, the note comes along and they realise this is a lot more serious. How long did it take them to draw connections between Kerry and Bruce?
It actually took a couple of days. The police were questioning everyone who'd been in or around the house, including the nanny, Amanda. She told the police about this very strange visit that this man had paid to Kerry some weeks earlier, which she was rather suspicious about. And she described the man, so the police showed her photograph albums from the family, and eventually she came across a photograph in the album from some years earlier where Crown Equipment had had a kind of like a special day for employees at the Whelans family property, and she saw a photograph of Bruce Burrell and said, that's the man who came to visit Kerry a few weeks ago and had this strange meeting with her. So at that stage, the police immediately paid attention to Bruce Burrell. They then asked Bernie about Bruce Burrell, and he was able to tell them about this very strange phone call that preceded the visit to Kerry, and also about the loss of his gun and the loss of his cattle.
I've heard it said flippantly by people that don't know a lot about the law that you can't prosecute someone or you can't find someone guilty of murder without a body. Is that true, and how did this case play out, given that for Dorothy and for Kerry there was no body?
Look, it's a misconception that some people have. You can have a murder trial without a body, but you still have to prove death. And with somebody like Dorothy Davis or Kerry Whelan, it's not that hard to prove death, because if you prove that they were leading happy, healthy lives with huge number of contact with family and friends and access to money and access to services and all the rest, and then you prove that at a particular day absolutely everything ceases. There's no contact with anyone, there's no access to any money or services, they haven't left Australia. It is possible to prove death quite easily.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with former Senior Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi about the double murder of Dorothy Davis and Kerry Whelan. Bruce thought he was pretty clever, and he had made this plan, especially for Kerry's abduction, that he thought was pretty foolproof and that they wouldn't be able to connect him to it. What are some of the mistakes he made that meant that police were able to say, all right, this man is our prime suspect?
Look, he made a whole lot of mistakes. The first mistake he made was contacting Bernie on the phone. The second mistake was turning up at their property at Kurrajong. The third mistake that he made was that when he arranged to meet Kerry, at Parramatta on the day of her disappearance, he actually used his own vehicle. Now, when I say his own vehicle, it didn't belong to him. It was a vehicle that he liked and that he'd stolen from a car yard. But it was a vehicle that was in his possession. And one of the things that the police did is the hotel where Kerry had parked a car on the day that she disappeared had cameras everywhere, so they looked at the recordings from these cameras. And most of the cameras were pointed indoors, but there was one particular camera that was actually on the outside but pointing in towards the glass door of a bar, and the lights were off inside, and this glass door on that particular day, which was overcast, acted like almost like a mirror to show what was happening outside on the street at the time. And from that particular camera, the police officer in charge, Detective Chief Inspector Dennis Bray, was able to see the top of Kerry's head walking from the car park exit towards the edge of the pavement. And then about 45 seconds later, this car pulled out from the parking lane into the middle lane, and it was very, very clearly a two-door, two-tone, four-wheel drive Pajero with a running board, no roof rack, and he could see from another shot earlier through the front door of the hotel that that vehicle, when it first came into the front of the hotel, had a very dirty rear windscreen from the windscreen wiper on the rear windscreen. So they could see the exact kind of car that Kerry Whelan had got into on the day of her disappearance. Now, about 10 days or so after Kerry's disappearance, the police raided Bruce Burrell's property at Bungonia. And amongst other things, they found this stolen two-door, two-tone, four-wheel drive Pajero with a running board, no roof racks, and a dirty rear windscreen of exactly the same description as the one that had been seen in the video from the hotel. So this was strong evidence that Bruce Burrell had been responsible for Kerry Whelan's disappearance. The police then embarked upon a huge project, a huge exercise to locate the owners of every single two-door, two-tone Pajero of that make and model in New South Wales. And they were able to locate and interview almost every single owner of that vehicle to find out where the vehicle was at that particular time on that particular day. And the aim of the exercise was to exclude any other vehicle of that description from having been in Phillip Street, Parramatta, outside the Park Royal Hotel on that day. Now, they weren't able to find absolutely every single owner because there were some that had died and some that had gone overseas. But they managed to find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them and interview them and exclude them as having possibly been outside the Park Royal Hotel. So whilst it didn't conclusively prove that it must have been this one vehicle, it went a long way in that direction. And together with Bruce Burrell's possession of that vehicle and the fact that he had been at Kerry Whelan's property some weeks prior to her disappearance without any real explanation for it, provided very strong evidence for Bruce Burrell's involvement in her disappearance and, of course, her death.
And how did the connection to Dorothy Davis come up all those years later?
Well, when Dennis Bray, the Chief Inspector in charge of the Kerry Whelan disappearance, began investigating that case, he was informed that Bruce Burrell had been a suspect for the disappearance of Dorothy Davis. So he went back and got all of the papers associated with the investigation and then decided to do a little bit more probing, and he did two things. The first thing is he went and got the credit card records for that birthday lunch that supposedly was held on the day of Dorothy's disappearance and found out it hadn't been held on that day, it had been held on another day. He then got hold of Bruce Burrell's telephone records and was able to say that on the day of Dorothy Davis's disappearance, within an hour or so of Dorothy disappearing, Bruce Burrell had suddenly and unexpectedly left his home in the southeastern suburbs of Sydney and driven almost 2 hours to his property at Bungonia. He spent about an hour there and drove all the way back. And we're able to prove this because of the phone records that he made on the way down there and on the way back. And then the next day he made a very similar trip down to Bungonia, where he spent this time about 2 hours down there. Both those trips were without warning. His wife didn't know that he was going down there. So our case was that this was an opportunity for Bruce Burrell to have disposed of the body of Dorothy Davis.
Where do you think Bruce disposed of the bodies? Because to this day they haven't been found.
It's correct. They have not been found to this day. On Hilliedale and in the huge national park near to Hilliedale, there are lots of disused old mine shafts and ventilation shafts from shale mining in decades past. And the theory was that he must have disposed of both bodies down one of those ventilation shafts. The police extensively searched all of the shafts they were able to find. Some of them were terribly dangerous. They were very old and in danger of collapse. And despite their best efforts, they were not able to find either body. But they did find some very important evidence in Bruce Burrell's homestead at Hilliedale. When they searched the homestead, they found 3 dot point notes that were of significance. The first one was a dot point note that we could show was an early outline of the kidnapping plan. The second dot point note was an early outline of the ransom note. And the third dot point note was an outline of how he was intending to clean a car, a vehicle. And amongst other things, he'd written passenger side half an hour. Now, one asks, why on earth would you want to spend half an hour cleaning out the passenger side of a car unless it was the scene of a crime and you wanted to make sure that there was no fingerprints or DNA there. We were able to use the first 2 dot point notes in the first trial, the trial of Bruce Burrell for the abduction and murder of Kerry Whelan. We weren't able to use the car cleaning note. That was excluded from the evidence by the trial judge.
This is all extremely compelling evidence and surely difficult for Bruce to explain otherwise. Did he ever confess?
He never confessed. However, he did something incredibly stupid during the time that the police were searching Hilliedale. Not only were there a whole lot of police in and around the homestead and searching all the mine shafts on his property, but there was a large contingent of media that was camped at his front gate. And there was a lot of publicity in the media about this search, and that media attention made it very clear that the police had only one suspect for the disappearance of Kerry Whelan, and that was Bruce Burrell. So there was an enormous amount of pressure on him, and I think it was the 5th day of the police search. He felt under such stress, under such pressure, that he did something that was very stupid. He managed to leave the homestead without the police following him, and he went on a quad bike to one of his neighbours' homes and convinced his neighbour to lend him his car, which he did, and then he went from there into Goulburn. And once in Goulburn, he made absolutely sure that he wasn't being followed. He went to a telephone booth, made a phone call, and then went to another telephone booth about 20 minutes later, outside the Empire Hotel in the main street of Goulburn. And he made a call from that phone booth to Bernie Whelan's workplace, that is, Crown Equipment in Smithfield. And he spoke to a receptionist. He told the receptionist a piece of code which had been in the ransom note that only the kidnapper could have known, and then said something to this effect: tell Bernie to call off the police. If he ever wants to see Kerry alive again, he's got to call off the police. Now, the police almost immediately found out about this call. A couple of days later, they interviewed Bruce Burrell, and they asked him, were you in the phone box outside the Empire Hotel at this particular time on this particular day? Now, Bruce Burrell thought that he hadn't been followed by the police, but he wasn't 100% certain. And he knew that if he denied having been there, and they could prove, maybe with photographs or whatever, that he was, that would be very suspicious. So what he did is he confessed that he'd been in the phone box at that particular time on that particular day, but suggested that he was ringing his solicitor to make an appointment. His solicitor's office was around the corner. Now, we were able to prove that the call to Crown Equipment had been made from that phone box at that particular time. We're able to prove that he did make a phone call to his solicitor, but earlier in the day. So this was, again, very cogent evidence of his identity as the kidnapper and therefore the murderer of Kerry Whelan.
As you say, there were multiple trials, and in 2006 he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the kidnapping and murder of Kerry Whelan. And then 2 years later, he was sentenced to 28 years for the murder of Dorothy Davis. Were these difficult convictions for a court to reach, given the evidence and given the fact that there was still no bodies?
Look, any murder trial is difficult. The burden of proof on the Crown is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard of proof. The cases against him were circumstantial, which doesn't mean that it was weak. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that circumstantial evidence is weaker than direct evidence, but that's often not the case. They were lengthy trials. Each trial took about 3 months, which is not uncommon these days for a complex murder investigation. The very first trial for the murder of Kerry Whelan, the jury failed to agree, and in those days it had to be a unanimous verdict. After the jury were discharged without a verdict, a lot of the jurors went to the media and complained that one of their members had refused to properly engage with them and had been irrational, and that they'd been totally frustrated in not being able to bring in a verdict. As a result of that, the New South Wales government brought in majority verdict provisions that enable some juries sometimes to come back with majority verdicts. So the second trial was a retrial of Bruce Burrell for the murder of Kerry Whelan, and the jury in that case convicted him unanimously. And then the third trial was the trial in relation to the murder of Dorothy Davis, and he was convicted of that.
Finally, I wanted to ask you how you felt about the news in 2016. When Bruce died, he hasn't confessed. He hasn't told anyone where those bodies are. How does that feel, knowing that we might never ever know?
Look, I think it's very sad for the families of Dorothy Davis and Kerry Whelan that they haven't been able to locate their bodies and give them a proper burial. I think there's a very ready explanation for Bruce Burrell's position, and I've seen it time and time again in my many years' experience both as a prosecutor and a defence barrister. If somebody's given a very lengthy sentence like Bruce Burrell was, any contact that they have with the outside world is of extreme importance and value. And if there's one person even on the outside who still believes in them, then that provides a rationale for maintaining their innocence, just to preserve that link with the outside world. And my thought is that Bruce did have several people on the outside who still had contact with him and still maybe were supporting him. I don't know. But maybe it was because of that he was unwilling to provide the location of these bodies, because that would have entailed admitting his guilt to those few people who still supported him. I can understand those people who still support someone in that situation. I think it's actually really important, even someone serving a lengthy sentence in jail, to have that sort of contact with the outside world and to have some support like that. So I can only say that that role that they played is important, but I think it's because of that, and I've seen this many times, that people will continue, despite overwhelming evidence, to refuse to acknowledge their guilt.
And it Feels like a final act of power, like maybe the only power they have left is to not tell. And it's, also a final act of cruelty.
Look, Dennis Bray and his offsider went several times into the jail where Bruce Burrell was to try and convince him to disclose the whereabouts of the bodies. They really did their best to try and convince him, but without success. And as you say, he passed away about 6 years ago now without having disclosed the location.
Thanks to our guest, Mark Tedeschi, for assisting us in telling this story. As a barrister and a Crown prosecutor for 35 years, Mark has appeared in some of the most significant criminal cases in Australia. He has been the senior Crown prosecutor in New South Wales for 15 years and is the president of the Australian Association of Crown Prosecutors. He's also the author of a number of true crime books. His latest, Missing, Presumed Dead, takes a look inside the investigation and legal proceedings of the double murder of Dorothy Davis and Kerry Whelan, while exploring the dark recesses of the mind of Bruce Burrell. All proceeds from this book will be donated to Australian charities that assist and support victims of crime, the families of deceased victims, and the relatives of those who have gone missing. You'll find a link to purchase in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.